The galactic assembly chamber hovered above the pale blue star of Nerex Prime, a ring of living crystal and alloy where hundreds of species gathered, and on that cycle the mood was casual, almost bored, because the agenda item labeled Human Petition had already been decided in private whispers and dismissive data packets. And when the human delegation ship arrived late and alone, the murmurs turned into open amusement as tall insectoid envoys flexed their wings and reptilian generals displayed teeth meant to intimidate, and even the machine intelligences dimmed their lights as if conserving energy for something more important. Because humanity had been classified for decades as a low-threat developing species, clever with trade, noisy in diplomacy, but militarily shallow, spread thin across too much space with too little force. And the council speaker, a broad Shell-Corth representative named Salvek, formally opened the floor by stating in a flat tone that the council had reviewed the border incidents and found that human claims of harassment were exaggerated, at which point laughter rippled to the chamber as hollow displays showed fragmented human patrol, craft retreating from sleek alien cruisers. And Salvek continued by saying that the council would not sanction action against the Vrax Dominion, a power whose fleets had subjugated 12 systems in the last cycle alone, because the humans lacked the strength to enforce any ruling, and therefore the matter was considered closed. And it was then that the human representative stood, not the expected ambassador with careful words and soft posture, but uniformed officer with gray hair cut short and eyes that did not move with the room, Admiral Jonathan Hale, commander of the Third Deep Fleet, whose presence alone caused a slight pause because humans rarely sent military officers into political chambers, and Hale spoke calmly, thanking the council for its time, and then asking a single question about procedure, whether a representative was permitted to respond before final dismissal, and Salvek, amused, granted it, expecting bluster or emotional appeal, and Hale did neither. Instead, he began by acknowledging that humanity was young compared to the ancient powers in the chamber, that human ships were fewer, that their territory was scattered, and that by traditional metrics the council used, humanity did appear weak, and several delegates nodded, satisfied, but then Hale shifted, saying that the council metrics were outdated, built on assumptions that conquest required mass, that dominance required visible fleets, and that power was measured in how many worlds could be burned in a single campaign. And as he spoke, the chamber grew quieter, not because of volume, but because of tone, a steady certainty that did not ask for approval. And Hale explained that humans had learned early that they could not win by matching others ship for ship, so they had stopped trying and instead focused on control, denial, and consequence, words that drew confused looks. And he continued by describing how human space was not defended by walls, but by layers, how every shipping lane was mapped not just physically but mathematically, how every jump point carried silent observers, how every human colony maintained independent command authority in the event of isolation, and how every human fleet captain was trained not to seek battle, but to decide when battle was inevitable, and only then to end it completely. And when a Vrax military observer interrupted, stating that such doctrine was meaningless without strength to back it, Hale simply nodded and said that strength was context. Then he raised his wrist and authorized the data release, and the chamber displays shifted as council security systems, which had not been challenged in centuries, accepted the feed without alarm, showing real-time positions of Vrax patrol groups along the disputed border, including one that officially did not exist. And murmurs turned sharp as several delegates realized the data was accurate to the second, and Hale stated that humanity had not come to ask for protection, but to give notice that 3 hours earlier human forces had initiated a containment operation across 14 systems, that no shots had been fired, no planets touched, no civilians harmed, but that Vrax military logistics had ceased functioning, their fleets stranded between jumps, their command relays isolated, their supply nodes locked by human code that did not break systems but convinced them to stop responding, and the Vrax observer demanded proof, at which point the observer's own command implant failed to receive a routine status update, and silence fell hard, and Hale said quietly that humans did not destroy what they could turn off, that war was not about how loudly one could strike, but how completely one could decide the outcome, and he reminded the council that humanity had respected borders, treaties, and warnings until those were ignored, and that weakness was often confused with patience, and patience was finite, And as Salvek attempted to restore order, Hale concluded by stating that the Vrax Dominion would withdraw from all human claimed systems within one standard cycle, not because the Council ordered it, but because humanity had already made it the only viable option. And he ended by saying that if the Council wished to reconsider how it classified humanity, the data would remain available for exactly 6 minutes, after which human systems would resume their silence. And he sat down, leaving a chamber of ancient power staring at displays that showed a species they had dismissed not roaring in conquest, but calmly holding the levers of space. And for first time in many cycles, the laughter did not return. The shock that followed Admiral Hale's words did not fade when the human delegation departed, because across the chamber species began receiving delayed confirmations from their own intelligence branches that matched the human data exactly. And as the Council recessed in disarray, events continued to unfold beyond the polished crystal walls, where Vrax commanders discovered that their fleets were intact yet useless, their drives cycling without entering jump, their encrypted orders returning, unreadable echoes, and panic spread through a military culture built on overwhelming force rather than uncertainty. While on Earth and its outer colonies no celebrations were announced, no broadcasts made, only routine traffic in normal life, continuing as if nothing extraordinary was happening, because for humanity this was not a moment of pride, but a necessary correction. And Admiral Hale returned to the command carrier Resolute Path, where officers of varying ages awaited him with quiet discipline. And there he confirmed that Phase 1 was complete and reminded them that restraint remained the priority, because the objective was not humiliation but compliance, a concept some younger commanders still struggle with yet obeyed, while within the Vrax Dominion political leaders accused each other of incompetence and demanded demonstrations of strength, only to learn that any attempt to mass fleets triggered further system slowdowns, as the space itself resisted them, and analysts realized too late that human control was not centralized but distributed, making decapitation impossible. And when the Vrax attempted to appeal back to the Council for emergency authorization, they found the chamber paralyzed by fear of escalation, because if humans could quietly immobilize a major power without firing a shot, then every treaty, every balance of power assumption was suddenly suspect, and smaller species who had long suffered under Vrax pressure began to reconsider their silence, passing subtle data packets toward human channels, offering information, cooperation, and access, while on Mars a logistics director named Alan Brooks reviewed supply projections with the same calm he applied to civilian shipping, adjusting flows to account for long-duration readiness rather than combat surge, demonstrating again that human strength lay not in moments of fury, but in sustained control. And as days passed, the Vrax Dominion issued public denials, even as private withdrawals began, fleets slowly backing away from human space under the pretense of redeployment. And each successful retreat reinforced the reality that humanity had spoken once and did not need to repeat itself. And across the galaxy, a new understanding began to form. Not that humans were invincible monsters, but that they were careful planners who treated war as a system to be managed rather than a spectacle to be won. And that realization unsettled ancient empires far more than any show of brute force ever could. As the third phase unfolded quietly, humanity shifted from containment to demonstration without spectacle, and this was where the deeper unease began to spread, because of Vrax withdrawal exposed gaps in regional security that other powers rushed to fill, only to find that human traffic control systems were already coordinating safe passage, rerouting convoys, and preventing clashes before they happened, all without requesting authority. And this forced the Council to confront an uncomfortable truth that humans were already acting as stewards of stability rather than challengers for dominance, while Admiral Hale convened a secure briefing with fleet captains and civilian advisors where he emphasized that perception mattered as much as outcome, explaining that fear would provoke coalition against humanity, but reliability would invite dependence. And so human fleets remained mostly unseen, operating at the edges of sensor ranges, intervening only when escalation thresholds were crossed. And on a distant mining world previously taxed into poverty by Vrax enforcers, a human logistics ship arrived with repaired drones and medical aid under a neutral charter, creating confusion among locals who expected conquerors and instead found accountants and engineers. And this pattern repeated across multiple systems, eroding old loyalties and building quiet goodwill, while within the Vrax Dominion, a hardline faction attempted a covert strike against a human relay station to restore honor, only to have the strike force intercepted by automated warnings that offer a chance to withdraw, and when ignored, disable the ships with precise energy pulses that left crews alive but drifting, an incident that leaked despite censorship and shattered the myth of Rack's intimidation. And as debates raged in the council chambers about whether to formally reclassify humanity, intelligence reports accumulated showing that human doctrine emphasized predictability in ethics and unpredictability in tactics, a combination that made planning against them nearly impossible. And Hale, when informed of growing rumors that humanity was manipulating the galaxy toward dependence, responded simply that order was cheaper than war and easier to maintain, a statement that circulated widely and reframed human intent from threat to inevitability. And by the time the council reconvened, representatives spoke more carefully, no longer laughing, no longer dismissing, because they understood that the moment the human admiral spoke had not been a warning of what humans might do, but a clarification of what they had already decided to become. The fourth phase began when the council finally issued a formal communique requesting human attendance not as petitioners, but as consultants, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed across diplomatic channels, and Admiral Hale declined to attend personally, sending instead a small delegation led by civilian strategist Laura Bennett, whose calm explanations contrasted sharply with the fear driving the chamber, and she outlined human red lines with precise clarity: no forced tribute, no expansion by conquest, no interference with internal governance unless civilian harm crossed defined thresholds. Terms that sounded restrictive yet carried an implied enforcement capability everyone understood. And while some delegates protested the erosion of council authority, others privately admitted that authority had already eroded the moment humanity proved it could act without permission. And beyond the political theater, human systems adjusted again as distributed defense nodes shifted. From active suppression to persistent observation, allowing limited Vrax communications to resume under monitored conditions, which had the effect of restoring internal order within the Dominion, while keeping its military ambitions contained. And this calculated mercy fractured Vrax leadership, empowering pragmatic governors over warlords, while human analysts observed without interference, letting internal dynamics resolve naturally. And in one notable incident, a Vrax fleet commander attempted to test the limits by powering weapons during a border transit, only to have every non-essential system on his ships deactivate simultaneously, accompanied by a single message in plain Vrax trade language stating that escalation protocols were automatic and impartial, a phrase that spread through military circles like a quiet curse. And as weeks passed, shipping insurance rates dropped in regions under indirect human oversight, trade increased, and smaller species began aligning navigation standards with human models voluntarily, creating a web of interoperability that further embedded human influence without formal rule. And Hale, reviewing reports from Earth orbit, remarked to his staff that dominance achieved through fear required constant effort, but dominance achieved through reliability sustained itself. And this philosophy filtered down through human ranks, shaping decisions large and small, until the galaxy itself began to operate on assumptions of human presence, not as conquerors or rulers, but as a final constraint against chaos. And by the end of that cycle, the phrase humans are weak vanished from official discourse, replaced instead by quieter assessments that spoke of a species that did not shout its power, because it did not need to. By the fifth phase, the consequences of that shift had reached even the most distant observers, because empires that once measured strength by fleet tonnage began auditing resilience instead, and those audits kept pointing back to human models, where redundancy, autonomy, and ethical constraint were treated as force multipliers rather than weaknesses. And this intellectual realignment unsettled old hierarchies more deeply than any blockade could have, while within the Vrax dominion the internal struggle intensified as provincial leaders petitioned for trade normalization with human space, arguing that stability brought profit and profit brought legitimacy, a logic that appealed to civilian populations exhausted by constant mobilization. And human trade envoys responded slowly and deliberately, tying access to transparent accounting and civilian protections, conditions that reshaped Vrax governance from the inside without a single decree. And when a rogue Vrax splinter group launched an unsanctioned raid against a neutral transport to provoke renewed war, human response came not as retaliation but exposure, releasing incontrovertible data that traced command responsibility and funding, forcing the Dominion to publicly disavow and arrest its own officers, an act that would have been unthinkable cycles earlier And this moment marked a turning point because it showed the galaxy that human power extended into narrative control, shaping what actions meant rather than merely stopping them. And Admiral Hale, observing from a distance, authorized a gradual drawdown of active measures, confident that the systems now reinforce themselves. And as human fleets faded further into background roles, their absence did not weaken order but confirmed it, and Council delegates quietly adjusted long-term projections, reclassifying humanity not as a challenger empire, but as a structural force, something closer to gravity than politics. And among junior diplomats, a new rule of thumb circulated that if humans had spoken once, they would not repeat themselves, because repetition implied negotiation, and humanity no longer needed to negotiate its relevance, having demonstrated through calm action that being underestimated was not a flaw, but a strategic advantage they had mastered. The sixth phase unfolded almost invisibly, which in hindsight many analysts would later identify as the most decisive period, because with overt pressure removed, the galaxy began revealing its true shape, and human observers cataloged patterns of trade, migration, and minor conflicts that had been suppressed or distorted by dominant empires. And this data fed into adaptive models that allowed human planners to anticipate instability months before it surfaced, while the Council, increasingly reactive rather than directive, relied on human forecasts to avoid crises it could no longer manage alone. And this reliance bred quiet resentment among older powers even as they accepted the necessity, and within human space a new generation of officers and administrators took responsibility under doctrines shaped by Hale's original stance, emphasizing restraint backed by certainty. And one such officer, Fleet Coordinator Daniel Price, authorized a limited intervention to prevent a brewing conflict between two mid-tier species by adjusting transit windows and energy pricing, a mundane action that nonetheless prevented a war, illustrating again that human influence often operated through systems rather than weapons. And the Vrax's dominion, now constrained and reforming, attempted to regain prestige by proposing joint security initiatives, which humans accepted cautiously, embedding transparency requirements that further diluted unilateral aggression. And as these cooperative frameworks expanded, they created a mesh of mutual dependencies that made sudden domination by any single power impractical, effectively locking the galaxy into a new equilibrium centered on predictability. And when a distant empire tested this balance by massing forces beyond agreed thresholds, it was not human fleets that responded first, but regional coalitions using human protocols, demonstrating that humanity's greatest achievement was not control but delegation. And Admiral Hale, nearing retirement, observed these developments with measured satisfaction, noting that the moment he spoke before the Council had not been about asserting authority, but about setting direction. And now that direction persisted without his presence, confirming that the galaxy had crossed a point of no return where the question was no longer whether humans were weak or strong, but how long the galaxy had mistaken quiet competence for absence. The seventh phase carried a sense of inevitability that few wanted to acknowledge openly, because the structures humanity had put in place were no longer experimental or provisional but habitual, and habits are harder to break than laws. And across dozens of systems, merchants, governors, and even military planners began defaulting to human-mediated channels for dispute resolution, simply because outcomes were consistent. And this consistency gradually reshaped expectations of what power was supposed to do, while the Council itself became more a forum for ratifying realities than creating them, a transformation that older delegates found humiliating but younger species embraced as stability. And in one revealing session, a Council analyst presented a long-term projection showing that regions operating under human influence protocols experience lower conflict, higher economic growth, and fewer humanitarian crises, a result that sparked muted outrage from imperial representatives, who realized too late that the metrics of success had shifted away from domination, and within human ranks there was careful monitoring to prevent complacency, with Admiral Hale's successors emphasizing that trust once lost would be far harder to regain than fear ever was. And this caution proved justified when a human corporate consortium attempted to exploit a peripheral system under the assumption of implicit protection, only to find human enforcement acting against its own citizens with uncompromising transparency, a decision that rippled to the galaxy and reinforced the idea that human rules applied inward as well as outward. And the Vrax's dominion, now several cycles into reform, formally acknowledged wrongdoing in its earlier campaigns, and negotiated reparations frameworks rather than surrender terms, an act that marked the symbolic end of its era as a terror power. And as Hale prepared to step down from active command, he recorded a final address for internal archives, noting that the greatest risk ahead was not alien hostility but human arrogance, warning that strength unexamined decayed into tyranny. And those words circulated quietly among senior leadership, shaping doctrine even after his departure. And by the close of that cycle, it was clear that the galaxy no longer revolved around the loudest fleets or the oldest empires, but around a species that had spoken once, acted calmly, and then let the consequences teach everyone else what that speech had truly meant. The eighth and final phase arrived not with ceremony, but with quiet confirmation, because by then the galaxy had already adapted to a reality shaped by human presence. And what remained was understanding rather than resistance. And in the years following Admiral Hale's retirement, the structures he helped set in motion continued to operate without his voice or image attached, which was precisely the point. As human fleets remained dispersed, human systems remained open yet guarded and human. Policies remained boringly consistent, and boredom in geopolitics proved to be the most stabilizing force of all, and historians across multiple species would later mark the council session where humans were called weak as the moment everything changed, not because of threats issued or battles fought, but because a single human admiral had reframed power as responsibility backed by capability. And the lesson spread slowly but permanently that underestimating humanity had never been about missing hidden weapons or secret fleets, but about failing to recognize a mindset that treated survival, cooperation, and long-term consequence as strategic tools. And in the final assessment delivered to the reconstituted council decades later, a neutral synthesis intelligence concluded that humanity did not dominate the galaxy through fear, numbers, or conquest, but through the rare ability to decide when force was unnecessary and when restraint was the sharper weapon, and that civilizations, which adapted to this reality, prospered while those that resisted diminished. And so the phrase that replaced all earlier classifications in the council archives was simple and unadorned, stating that humanity was no longer to be evaluated as weak or strong, aggressive or passive, but as decisive, a species that spoke once when it mattered, and built a galaxy that listened long after the words had ended.